So I'm going to talk a little bit about the brushes. So we have some different brushes here, and we have different sizes of brushes. You have small brushes as well as big brushes in your supply kit. But in theory, all you really need is one good brush, and you can do everything with it. Remember when we did the flat washes with the flat wash brush? You can also do washes by using the round brush and laying it from the side. Of course, it helps to have a larger brush. So the larger area you're working in, a larger brush gives you more water and more paint to move around. So if you're doing a small wash in a small area, you can use the side of the brush, the regular round brush. You can see it with the big sable round here that I have. You can see it's definitely a bigger brush. You can see how much more water the big brush holds. But when we're working with brushes, you want to work with all parts of the brush, or let's think about working with the tip of the brush. You can get really fine lines with the tip of the brush. You work with the side of the brush. You can go from thin to thick. So in watercolor, the brush is your friend. It's really the extension of yourself. You want to get comfortable working with the brush. You can practice different ways to make brush strokes, working with the tip of the brush. To make loose strokes like that. And same thing with the flat wash. So you know how to do the flat wash with the brush, but the flat, this is called a flat because it's flat on the top and flat on the sides here. You know how to make that type of stroke, but you can think of it as you can do calligraphic strokes with it. You can work with the tip edge of this to get a nice straight line. So you really want to get comfortable with the brush, practice working and making different kinds of brush strokes. Now, one of the things we have on our flat wash brush is what we call a scraper handle. It's a beveled edge. And this is something that you use when you're making certain textural effects. As you can see, I can scrape through the wet paint. Make certain marks with it. Now, once the paint's dry, I can't do that. It has to be, you have to do this when it's wet. So again, with brushes now, there's wet onto wet, wet down the area. There's wet on dry, which is the brush is wet, it has paint in there, but the paper is dry. Wet into wet, the paper is wet, and then the wet surface grabs the paint out of the brush and disperses it for a much softer effect. There's another effect called dry brush. And I squeeze the water out of the brush. You can see me squeezing it out here. Actually, I'll put this aside and use the brush that you have. So the brush is fairly dry. And then I roll the brush in the paint without so much water. And on a dry surface, I rub the brush around the paper. You can see that it picks up the texture of the paper. And this is called dry brush. It's a textural effect when you want to create rough surfaces, textures like this. And this was very popular I'd say in the 50s, working on a very textured paper and doing dry brush techniques. It creates a lot of texture that you can use for, say, showing rough surfaces like wood or sand and even water. It's a good technique for that. The round brushes do not normally come with a beveled edge. It's just the flat brushes that come with that. So one thing we're going to try now is something called puddling, which is similar to, there's a couple of ways to do it, and one way is like working wet into wet. So I have a wet surface here. I'll let that absorb for a while. And another one is to just create a puddle of paint. I'm going to let that absorb for a while. In watercolor, you have to be patient and let the paint absorb into the paper for certain effects. So over here, now this is the wet surface, I'm going to take, let's take a different color here. Take our cerulean blue, and now I have paint in the brush. It's pretty full. And I just drop it in there. You can see how the wet surface is dragging that paint around. So it disperses all of that pigment. Over here in my painted area, what I'm going to do is get rid of all the paint in my brush. And I still have water in the brush, and I'm going to take water and drop it into the painted area. You see how the water drops in there and disperses all of that pigment. And as it moves out, it's going to create this little rough edge crust of texture at the edges. Remember that the paint goes where the water goes. So right now the water is pushing the paint. And you can create some very interesting textures doing that. I like to do a lot of puddling in my work. And something called wet lifts, which we'll talk about next. You have to let it take effect. You see how it's much lighter in the center, and now we have these little crusts of rough edges around there. And over here, you notice the paint went where the water was, and we have the little rough edges where it stopped moving here. But the paint dispersed, and so it's much softer in here. Just a softer puddle of paint. This is course, it's a little harder with on the dry paper with the hard edge, but in the center you can see that the water pushed the paint out to the edge.